What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Ableton from Scratch. This is episode number 3. My name is Armand, and I'm a Toronto-based deep and progressive house DJ and producer, and I've made this Ableton course for people who have zero experience with music production. I've taken the assumption that you've never used Ableton before and have never tried your hand at music production. So if you're completely starting from scratch, then this Ableton series is for you. On week 1, 2 lessons ago, we learned the basic layout and functionality of the software, how to navigate around, and how to write in basic notes. And last week, we worked on how to build out a good drum beat. And I'm using a progressive house song that we're going to build and create together. We're going to keep building on that week after week. This week, we learned how to write in bass lines. So let's dive into the computer and continue building our song together. Okay, so here's the drum beat that we created last week. And now it's time to add some bass underneath this. So let's go over here and right click for a new MIDI track. So I'm going to use a MIDI instrument from Ableton. Or alternatively, by the way, you can just go and find the instrument you want. And if it's a MIDI, you can just drag and drop it underneath here and it'll give you a fresh new track. Let's just expand that. Let's rename that to bass. Hit enter. And we're all set there. So now we're using the operator synth. I know there's a lot of good bass sounds in there, so let's expand that and see what kind of bass sounds are there to offer. All right, let's go with that one first. And I'm going to show you sort of 3 different styles of writing in bass lines for deep and progressive house music or for techno. The first one is to use the bass in kind of a simple, more of a rhythmic fashion, kind of in conjunction with the beat. So with these types of bass lines, typically they don't take too many different melodies. So they might just stay with one note or perhaps 2. And they might just kind of give a bit of a stab. So I'll try and write that in now. And I'll start recording and I'll use my MIDI controller to show you what that sounds like. Okay, let's take a look at that. So let's double click on the clip that was recorded and see where the notes landed. I'm probably going to need to quantize this, so let's do Command A, and then Command U is going to snap them to the grid, and we'll see if we need any adjustment. Good to have the metronome on for this period of time as well to make sure everything lines up rhythmically. See, there's one mistake already. That needs to be moved over. Now, since that rhythm repeats for 4 measures, I'll just delete these ones rather than fixing them individually. I'll just come over in here and duplicate this one since I've already corrected it. Bit of a time saver. Okay, that sounds fine. I'm going to turn off the metronome. And maybe now we'll think about changing one of the notes at the end to kind of change it up. Let's try that. Okay, and before duplicating this clip here, let's make sure that this marker has gone exactly to the grid. It looks like it has, that's good. I'm going to zoom back out on this, and now I'm going to duplicate this clip here. And now we can have a listen to the sound. Soloing the bass, I think it's a little quiet. I'm going to turn that up a bit. So that type of bass line is, as you can see, a little bit maybe simple, might seem a bit boring in a vacuum, but if you're going to have a really busy song with lots of other kind of driving rhythms and melodies going on with other sounds, Sometimes you want kind of a simple kind of rhythmic bass line like this, just to kind of fill up the frequency spectrum, add some meat into the beat. But now let's take a look at something getting a little bit more of a melody out of a bass line. If you're writing slightly slower music, say you're writing deep house, so let me take this BPM down from 124. I'll put it down to 120, say. Oops. 120, which is a good speed for deep house. And probably your beat's not going to be as busy for a deep house track either, so let me just save this clip for later. And maybe I'll take away a few of the kind of driving elements from this. Probably don't need those. That's a little better for deep house. Not perfect, but for this example, it'll work. So here we're going to find kind of a longer, smoother bass line. And this is, as I say, this is the second type of bass line, or the second category. This is where you're going to have longer, lasting, sustaining notes from the bass that are going to contribute a bit more to the melody of the song. So let me find something that sounds a little bit smoother here. Haha, not that. That might do. So let's work out a melody to play. All right, let's try writing that in. And let's have a look. I'll just correct that before I quantize. Okay, let's do a quantize now. Again, Command A and Command U. That one snapped to the wrong grid. There we go. Okay, so now let's contrast that to, suppose I had written this in a bit more of a simple fashion. I'm going to get rid of these little kind of pickup notes. And this is another way you could have written this. I'll just drag this out so it fills up the whole 4 beats of the measure. Same over here, and same over here. And that would sound like this. Right, so maybe you want it to sound simple, but if you want to do something a little bit more playful, maybe you can keep those pickup notes in there. And another way to make that even a bit more playful, for example, might be to have those pickup notes on an actual different note than the longer note that comes before it. So for example, you can step up before you step down. That sounds a bit more interesting. Let's keep that. Okay, so those are your longer bass sustaining type of melodies, good for deep house. Let's move on to number 3 now. Okay, so for number 3, this is where you're using kind of a combination of the previous 2 techniques. You're using some melodies and some longer notes on the bass, but you're also using some silence and space in between them to kind of let the melody breathe. So this is probably better for progressive house or techno music. So this is something I pre-wrote in advance, and we'll just take a look here what the notes look like. And we're back up to 124 beats per minute, as you'll see up here. So let's just listen to this. Okay, so now for the third idea. It's kind of a combination of the first 2 ideas I've just shown you. And so you're going to use the bass melodically with some different melodies and different notes playing. However, you're not going to use the really long sustaining notes that sustain through the entire 4 beats of a measure. You're going to use some silence to break it up, And for this, it's more for progressive house or techno, I would say, if you want to get a bit of a more driving kind of meaner sound from the bass line. So we're back up to 124 beats per minute here, as you can see. And this bass that I've selected, as you can hear, sounds pretty mean. It's got a kind of a growly and throaty tone to it. So let's just take a listen to this little melody that I wrote in advance. Okay, so the idea here is you can see there are some blank spots that alone now they sound a bit funny, but the idea is that once we keep composing, we're going to be filling up this space and this space and this space with another instrument that's going to kind of speak melodically to the bass line, something that'll be complementary. So once you add that in, it's going to sound a lot more natural. You might also notice that the bass sounds a little bit abrupt, like these notes sound a bit abrupt because they're not longer. So that might be okay, but for now, let's see if we can kind of improve on that a little bit. Now, I think we might do that with reverb rather than actually drawing the notes out longer. I don't like to normally use a bunch of reverb on a bass line because bass already takes up a lot of low end in the frequency spectrum, and it can add some challenges in terms of mastering the sound and making sure it's not in conflict with a bunch of other sounds in your mix when you're actually finalizing the song. However, if we use the reverb sparingly, I think we can probably it'll probably be okay. So I'm going to come up here and grab a reverb from the audio effects, drag it down, and I don't want too much of this reverb, so I'm just going to start with 25% on the dry wet control, and we'll see how that sounds. We'll solo the bass by hitting S on the keyboard. Okay, maybe we could stand to have a little more. I think that sounds pretty good. Let's hear it with the drums. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. All right, now one of the things that I do like to do before moving along in a song is to see if I can get a good kind of EQ balance between my kick drum, which also takes up a lot of space in the bass frequencies of the song, and the bass itself. So what I'd like to do is just give you a kind of a quick crash course in EQing with that. So what we're going to do here is come to the audio effects section, and we're going to select an EQ or an equalizer. I like the EQ8 in Ableton, and you'll see it appears down here in our chain. So this is for the kick, and let's just let it play in solo. And I can double click in this EQ in the black space to make it bigger. And so the way this works for anyone who hasn't used an EQ before is that from left to right is kind of bass up to treble. So when I play the kick, you'll hear and you'll see that the vast bulk of this sound is in the lower end frequencies, okay? So if you come down here in Ableton, you can put your mouse here and you'll see that this is the 100 hertz line. But as I move my mouse to the left, you'll see in the blue box over here that the hertz frequency is changing. So the human ear can hear roughly between 20 hertz, so from down here, all the way up to, I think it's 20,000 hertz somewhere over here, or 20 kilohertz. So on the extreme high end of the frequency. So with the kicks, as I say, they take up most of the space in the lower end frequency range. Is kind of between 20 hertz up to 100 or 200 hertz is really where the most of the meat of the kick is living. However, it does also have a little bit of a trebles over here too. As you can see, they're not as prominent, but that's because there is that little kind of snap or kick initially at the beginning of a kick drum that makes it kind of, pop in your ear. So if I were to accentuate the treble frequencies, you might be able to hear it by dragging these numbers up, dragging the line up. That's allowing me to allow those higher end frequencies of the kick to shine a little more and be a little more prominent, right? So if I turn this EQ off while it's playing by, again, using that little yellow dot, without and with. You can hear the difference. So let's put those back where they belong for now. So what we're trying to do here, the process of EQing, when you go to do that mostly at the end of a song, when you're really putting the finishing kind of polish on it, but it's good to do some of this as you go so you make your life easier later and your mix sounds better as you're working. The idea is not to have too many frequencies or too many different sounds or instruments fighting over space in the frequency spectrum. We don't want them all to be clustered in one area, right? So we want to spread them out all across the frequency spectrum as best we can. So in the case of kick and bass, you really have to kind of worry about this general area here. So let's play it again. And we can see that the real kind of peak of this kick is living between, let's track this grid line down here, about 40 hertz to about 80 hertz over here. So remember those numbers. And now let's do the same thing on the bass line. We'll put an EQ8 on there and we'll play it and see what it sounds like. And we'll watch, more importantly, on the equalizer. And as you can see here, the real peak of this bass line right now is landing at the 40 hertz mark, sort of between 30 hertz to maybe about 50 or 60 hertz. So as you can deduce from that, there's a good amount of overlap between the kick and the bass. So what I'd like to do is use the tools available to us with the EQ to put a little dip in here to allow the kick drum some extra kind of room to shine, because I don't want it fighting with the bass line too much. And from the controls down here, you can customize just how steep that dip will be. That's called the Q value. So here I'm working on the point number 2. So down here, I can adjust the Q value by clicking and scrolling there, and you'll see that I can control the steepness of that curve. So right now I want it probably around there, because I want to be able to dip about a range of 30 hertz. So then I can use the gain knob and pull that down, and it'll drag it down for me, or I can bring my mouse up here and just pull it down manually. And you can see that I've kind of missed a little bit. I'm a little too far to the right from where that big peak is hitting. So I'm going to drag with the frequency knob. I can drag it over, kind of get it more in the right place. Now, I don't want to kill off too much of the kind of throatiness and growl and aggressiveness of this bass line, because I like it. That's why I picked it. So we just need to do enough to give the kick a little bit of extra breathing room. So let's just toggle that on and off while it's playing. So it's on. Here's without the EQ. Back on. Right, so we're not hearing a huge difference. Now let's bring the kick back in. I'll turn it off. And back on. Not hearing too much of a difference, so I'm going to actually widen this Q value a little on point 2, and I'm going to increase the negative gain down a little more, and let's listen back. Without. And back on. It's a very subtle difference, but you may or may not be able to hear it right now. But trust me, later on, when we've got a whole bunch of more sounds going on in the mix, we're going to really be relying on a lot of these little adjustments across many different melodies and many different instruments to be able to have a crisp sounding mix that doesn't sound all muddy and cluttered. And some of this stuff is kind of felt, not heard. And so if you can't hear a dramatic result or difference immediately, don't worry. But these small adjustments we make as we go will add up in the long run to help keep your mix sounding better. Okay guys, that's going to do it for this week on basslines. Thank you so much for tuning in, and stay tuned for a very exciting session next week when we are going to dive right into lead and supporting melodies. See you next week.